Welcome to Echo, the podcast where we share our personal perspectives on questions about God, spirituality, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'm Ryan Becker, your host. No matter who you are, we hope that you find value and encouragement through real discussions about real things. Let's jump in. Echo.
This episode of the Echo Podcast is sponsored by Southern Adventist University.
Welcome to Echo. I'm Ryan Becker, your host, and this is the podcast where we talk about life and faith questions that young adults are dealing with and really kind of everyone deals with. The more I talk about these kind of topics, the more that I find that people of all ages struggle with this kind of thing. And so today is one that I'm interested in heavily. This is a conversation that I think is one of the first ones that this is a question that a lot of people who've grown up Christian tend to ask as like one of the initial questions in their journey a lot of the time. So I'm excited to kind of dive into this and figure this out. And to help me with that today, I have two wonderful guests, Casey and Luke, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So Casey, we'll start with you.
Sure. I'm Casey Vaughn. I'm actually a pastor here in the greater Charlotte area. And this is actually the first podcast I'll probably ever have listened to.
Ooh, this is exciting.
Yeah.
And then Luke, what about you?
So I'm Luke Kendall, and I'm a junior nursing student at Southern.
Sweet. So three very kind of different backgrounds here as far as framework and where we're coming from, which is good. And so today we're talking about Doctrines and Jesus. And the reason this question I think comes up a lot is mainly there are a lot of people, whether they become legalistic or like hyper conservative, and I don't say that to like bash conservatives. There are hyper liberals as well that aren't. It's not a good thing, right? But those that would balance the content of our beliefs rather than the substance of them, and you see this across the board in pretty much every denomination where there's that balance. That balance is skewed. And what ends up happening is it seems like the church becomes more about their beliefs and how those beliefs impact your behavior rather than the substance of those beliefs and why we have them to begin with. And so I think that's where the root of a lot of people's faith journeys starts. Let's kind of dive in here, right? I feel like my church talks about, like, let's say I'm a young adult. I realize that it would be weird if I just opened with I, right?
Yeah.
I feel like my church talks more about doctrines than Jesus, right? I thought we follow Jesus, but we're talking about the Sabbath, or we're talking about this X, Y, or Z more. What do you say to that? Like, do you see that happening a lot? Do you disagree with that? How do you feel about what are your initial thoughts there?
Well, I feel like I've seen a bit of both. Most of the time, I think I agree with you that they do tend to lean more towards doctrine in a lot of the churches I've been to. But, I mean, with everything, you have to find a good balance, because it is important to know, like, what you believe and why you believe, but also the foundation is Jesus and, what he did for us, dying on the cross for our sins. So it's very important to see both sides of the coin.
Yeah, absolutely. Casey, what about you?
If they're a young person and they feel like their church definitely focuses on doctrine more, I mean, that's within the realm of distinct possibilities and probabilities within the Adventist church. But I can't speak for every church, and there's going to be pockets in every church that feel the same or feel differently. So in that very same church, you might have someone that's like, no, we talk about Jesus too much.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's a little subjective. Not that does make your opinion right or wrong. It just means realizing that everyone has a different opinion, and everyone the line between doctrines and Jesus in people's minds is at a widely different place, depending on who they are and their background.
Well, and I think I love that you ended with the word background, because I think that's a huge part of this too. I think for a lot of people, if they came from a prior life of doing whatever they wanted and reaping whatever consequences may have been sown from that, they come into faith and they want a lot of boundaries and structure, versus someone else who may have grown up or came from a life where they had way too much structure, lived under a rock, and then they go, freedom, and they don't want the structure anymore. They realize that they have room to breathe now, and the risk for both of those camps is they swing too far the opposite direction.
I've realized that so much of our theology is reactionary, and personal theology, not necessarily corporate theology, but personal theology is often highly reactionary to other theologies or life experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have some sort of traumatic incident or some sort of experience, and that starts to shape our beliefs or impact our beliefs. I mean, an easy one for me would be actually this, I used to think that racism wasn't this huge deal that, and I used to think, this was years ago, but I used to think that, yeah, people were making kind of a more of a big deal out of it than it was. And then as I started talking with friends and learning from them and their experiences, that started to shape my perspective on it and change it. And it's like that with, I think, anything, whether you experience it or the people close to you experience it too.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's huge. Luke, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I feel like like you guys were saying, the perspective and your background matters a lot, because if, you're in a room with, say 4 people, 3 people, whatever, and if an event happens and then everyone was to, write down what happened, it would all be a little different. It's the same thing, but everyone sees it differently and values more different parts of it that are bigger, like, in meaning to them based on what they've gone through.
Yeah. Well, and I think we also have the risk here in this conversation of erring too much on the side of like, there's a presupposition happening here where I think all 3 of us, I could be wrong here and you can disagree, you'll just be wrong, that we would not necessarily rather talk about Jesus, but this idea that focus does need to be more on Jesus. And the problem with that is there are people that would say that, the doctrines do point to Jesus, that the doctrines are about Jesus. And, we can't just, just saying you follow Jesus isn't enough to say that you're doing things right. I would argue that the Crusades said they were following Jesus, right? Like, there's a lot of things that you can look at the anti-Semitism that is throughout all of Christian history through our church fathers. You'd be surprised at some of the things that Martin Luther said. Yeah. And you see that and you go, well, they followed, but they said they love Jesus. Like, just loving Jesus or talking about Jesus isn't enough to put you on the right track. Yeah. And you can err based on stepping out of his will. So, I get that doctrines are supposed to talk about Jesus, but what do you guys think is the kind of balance there? Or how do we talk about doctrines and Jesus in a way that actually works together?
Well, Jesus himself, went off and, does the same things that our doctrines stand for, what we believe. And so, but he doesn't, necessarily in his teaching state everything specifically, because there's also the Old Testament, which is where some other beliefs come from. And so there's this whole foundation that he built on and strengthened, and we can learn from and continue to grow through.
I think there's also a kind of a false dichotomy that we bring up, and I'm not 100% sure why, but we tend to take the whole idea of doctrines and Jesus and put them opposed to each other. So they're 2 separate entities, when actually our doctrines are just the most clear picture of Jesus and the Godhead that we have. They just influence each other. And Jesus is kind of, he was the Word, and I'm taking a little bit of a leap here, but not really, that he was the culmination of everything. He embodied everything that we believe. And so to set them apart as 2 different identities or entities is really creating this division that's not there.
Yeah.
They're both intricately involved. You cannot have one without the other. However, where you focus is still extremely important in that.
Yeah. The way I think I would say that is, the 2 definitely walk hand in hand, but you can talk about Jesus and forget the structure of
you can divorce them, yes.
Yeah, you can divorce them as far as application is concerned, and not even realize it. And that is the very definition of legalism if you put too much on doctrine. And it's the very idea of kind of moral relativism if you're just focusing on Jesus and I just got to love like Jesus. Man, everyone agrees with that statement, but everyone has a different picture of what love actually looks like. And so when you just say, I just wish we'd all love like Jesus, everyone goes, well, I am. So yeah, I don't need to change anything. Exactly. No, but I agree with that. I think we have caused kind of an unnecessary division or fracture between the 2. I think when you say that doctrines are the picture of Jesus, I think of looking at our 28 fundamental beliefs, and the question I don't think I've ever asked, and I'm realizing this now, I don't think I've ever looked at that list and said, what story does this list tell of Jesus, or what Jesus am I actually looking at here? Now I'm thinking through them, and while there are a couple things here and there that I disagree with within like the wording or something of our fundamentals, I agree with, like, I'm an Adventist, I was a pastor, I lay pastor, like I'm here, right? And the beauty of what I love about our, within Adventism, our doctrine, is the idea that we aren't creedal, like we don't have a creed. So those fundamental beliefs can be challenged and questioned and changed if need be. And I love that because...
And we've seen that they've added some in the past, so at least at that level.
Yeah. And we didn't even have them until recently, like within the last 50 years. So we didn't have an official like list of beliefs like this. But I love that because it says that Jesus is journeying with us and we're journeying with him. And we learn more along the way. We get corrected along the way. Like, I just think that's really kind of cool to see. And so the picture for me is painted more in the way we treat the doctrine rather than just the doctrine itself as well. So how when you look at some of the more behavior-based doctrines, right? So we talk about like Christian living,
like
or we
lifestyle.
talk about the Sabbath. They seem to be more behavioral focused in what we do. So how would you say some of those actually point to Jesus or paint a picture of Jesus? Like how do we interact with those that seem to just want to behavior or modify our behaviors?
I think this is where motivation comes in really heavily. Aside from, you have to view it in the context of Jesus as far as like lifestyle stuff. So how you live your day-to-day life, which is honestly where most of the contention between Jesus and doctrines really comes in. Because in theory, and the theological, whatever you want to call it, most people don't care and they don't see a divide and they doesn't affect them day to day. So the day-to-day lifestyle things really, it's where you're looking when you're trying to live like Jesus lived. So if I'm like, I want to do everything right because then that is the way that I will, not necessarily salvation, because I would propose that very few people in the church actually believe that by being vegan or not going out to eat on Sabbath, you're actually saved by that. But what there is I will lose my salvation if I don't do these things. So you bring that into the equation. And then, am I motivated because I love Jesus I'm doing these things? Or am I motivated because I feel out of fear, essentially, that I will lose something? And I think that, for me, at least personally, that's where I kind of gauge it. Like, am I choosing not to or to do this based on my love of Jesus and my belief personally that this is how I should live my life? Or is it because there is this set of check marks that I need so I don't lose my salvation? I'm not sure if that answered the question.
No, it does. You're saying it's the motivations. It's why you're doing it. And that, I think, so it's not necessarily that the beliefs themselves have to point to Jesus, but the way you respond to them.
Well, ultimately they do, whether you see it or not.
But your explanation was more focused on the response to them, more so than the beliefs themselves.
Yes.
So which is important, absolutely. So Luke, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That it goes along with your motivations for sure. Because if you like love Jesus, you're gonna be trying to be more like him, get closer with him, which hopefully eventually will lead you closer to following along with those doctrines. But also, like, it helps to have them in your back of your mind to follow when when you're not exactly sure where you should be going. You have this kind of guideline.
The structure.
Well, and when I look at some of these too, like, I think of the Sabbath. That's the one that, especially if you grew up Adventist as a kid, you only see the behavior side of it. And there's really not enough life experience.
True.
I don't know of I don't know of many kids who have like properly understood what it means, because kids don't like to nap or rest at a certain point. Like on Saturdays, for me growing up, my parents both worked full time. So Saturday, they slept after church. My dad would run sound. He'd be at church at 6 a.m. and he'd be there till 2, come home, bring us lunch or cook lunch. And my family, like my mom, my siblings, and I went to a different church because that's where all my friends were. So, but he'd come back and they'd be passed out for the rest of the day. And I'd be like, well, what do I do now? But I think now, looking at my life and seeing like the rush of everything, and I'm grateful for the Sabbath because it points, the picture to me that paints of Jesus is a God that cares about the fact that I'm getting rest, cares about restoring me, cares about time with me. And so it's more that it becomes then less about what I do or don't do, and more about the opportunities that are presented to me. Because I firmly believe this. If God hadn't been like, look, you have to take a day, like I'm banning, I'm banning you from working this day, we would work that day.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And I know that because I still fail at that sometimes. Like there are still things that I will do, and I know I shouldn't be doing them. And so I see that in the Sabbath easily. And so I can see that there are different areas where they would paint a solid picture of who Jesus is that I think is accurate to his life and what we see in the Gospels. So what if I don't care about them though? Like I don't care about all that stuff. Just I want to talk about Jesus.
In my experience, there have been moments where I definitely felt like that, and usually came for me personally. I can't speak to everyone, but for me personally, it was from a place of theological or lifestyle, just religion burnout. That I was like, forget everything. I kind of thought it in stronger languages, but forget everything. I'm going to just focus on the things that are easiest for me to swallow right now spiritually. And I think there's a place where that's okay.
Yeah.
But as far as if you're just, so if that's kind of where it's coming from, be able to take time out as long as there's some understanding that, I mean, even Jesus kept the Sabbath. Like, I'm not focusing on that specifically, but as long as there's understanding that the structure's there for a reason, it's not arbitrary, feel free to take that time off. However, if it's not from a place of burnout, I don't know. Usually I feel like it's from a place of reaction, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I agree as well. Like with the reaction part of that, more so for my life experience. Like sometimes when I've been like, I don't really want to deal with the doctrines right now, just focus on Jesus for a little bit and then work back to it.
Yeah.
Usually it's come after someone is like critique, not necessarily critique, but like criticized, and not like an uplifting way, but more like demeaning for something that like I know it was wrong, but they're like, no, the doctrines are this and you have to do this or else. And it's like, I don't really believe that way, because it's it's always changing kind of how you're going through life and how close you are with Jesus. And that's what matters the most out of it, is your relationship with him. The doctrines certainly help that though.
Yeah.
But they're not everything, and obviously Jesus isn't like everything either. It has to be a balance, because if you're just, I believe in Jesus, but you don't act like it and follow the doctrines, then you don't really. You're just saying it. So it goes back to the balance of it.
You're nominal at that point. I think I would agree with both of you here. I feel like it is reactionary to burnout, and I think that it's okay to need some space from if you are so focused or have had behavior crammed down your throat so much that you're losing your picture of who Jesus is, then it sounds like you need to chill out for a little bit. And that doesn't mean you go out and immediately do all the things opposite of what you believed before. Yeah. But I think actually what that tells me is you need to find a community that will and surround yourself with people that will encourage you in the right way and not cram that down your throat.
For me personally, when this happened, it told me I needed to take a look at my own theology, take a look at it and see why I was having a reaction. Yeah.
I think that's super huge, and I think letting people have their journey through that is really important. And I would argue the same as the other way too. If you're saying, give me I need more, I want to hear more about Revelation and the great controversy. I want to hear more about the Sabbath. I want to hear more about creation or marriage in the home versus Jesus and just talking about how much he loves me and his forgiveness, right? I think it's the same thing. It becomes reactionary, and you realize, like, I think a lot of people in that camp have had a very just criticism or a fair criticism in saying, like, yeah, we've talked so much about Jesus' mercy and grace that we're letting people off of the consequences of their actions in many cases, or we aren't calling people to accountability to the greater community that they've kind of, not promised themselves to, but really agreed to become a part of. And so they go, no, we need to, I get it. Jesus loves us, and he's merciful, and he's gracious, and he's patient, but he also calls us to do something more with that freedom that he's given us. And so I feel that, and so it is reactionary, and reactionary isn't always bad, but you just need to understand that, that's happening. Yeah, thank you guys for coming on. This has been cool. Any final thoughts here or words of encouragement to someone who is in that trying to live in that tension between the doctrines in Jesus that we see, which we've said there's not really one, we make it, but you're living in it right now. That's reality. So any words of encouragement to someone in that situation?
Well, I think another part of that tension that it's important to keep in the back of your mind while you work through it is it's the balance between religion and your belief in like Jesus specifically, because religion is its whole separate thing with all the different like structures and whatnot, and sometimes we get too caught up in that. But we need to focus a little bit more, I feel like, on our relationship with Jesus and what we believe for ourselves and how that impacts our lives.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I would agree with that 100%. Any final thoughts? Sweet. She just shook her head no. I love it. She's like, no, I said what I said. I said my piece, and I'm done. I would agree. I think the way that I see the doctrines in Jesus, and I think this is how I would kind of end this conversation, is I see it very much like, let's just take humans on Earth. I used to say like fish in a bowl, but that seemed too limiting. But like humans on Earth, if we just go without any proper protection or anything, we just go out into space, we leave Earth or the boundaries of the atmosphere, we just die.
I'm sure we were going to think humans versus aliens. Like,
we just die. There are boundaries in place but we are free within the confines of the Earth. The same thing, the behavioral kind of instruction that doctrines help us understand create boundaries in our lives, like the Sabbath, that protects us from overworking ourselves, or protects us from going so far that we would hurt ourselves or hurt someone else. And so understanding that you are truly free when you do put proper boundaries in your life, whether that's relational boundaries, belief boundaries, behavioral boundaries, whatever. But you have to figure out where those are in your relationship with Jesus, because those boundaries look different for every single person. So to our listeners, thank you for journeying with us through this one. And if you are in a position where you're trying to figure out your beliefs and where you kind of land on all this, know that we're praying for you.
Hit up Brian. He has all the answers.
And yeah, you can hit me up. I have literally every answer to every question ever. And it's probably not a good answer, though. And look, just thank you for being willing to journey through it. And we want you to know that it's okay to be on that journey. It's okay to be where you are. It's just not okay to stay there. So make sure that you are always moving forward and taking steps forward. Thank you guys for listening. If you want to check out more of Echo content or anything that the communication department at the Carolina Conference is putting out, then you can head on over to theprojectrefresh.org, and you can check out all the different shows and things that are developed, as well as more Echo episodes. So thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week. Hey guys, thanks so much for listening to this episode of Echo. We hope you enjoyed it. To stay up to date with new episodes as we release them, and for more awesome content from Project Refresh, a ministry of the Carolina Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button below. And don't forget to like and leave a comment.
This episode of the Echo Podcast is sponsored by Southern Adventist University.